I never thought I'd find myself in a battle over the right to live the way my family had for generations. The ranch had always been more than just land to me. It was legacy, blood, sweat, and a kind of peace you can only find under a wide sky, where the nearest neighbor was far enough not to smell the cattle. After serving 22 years in the Marines, all I wanted was to come back to the one place that had always made sense, my father's ranch on the outskirts of Maple Hollow. And for a while, that's exactly what I got: sunrises over the fields, the rhythmic thud of hooves, the familiar creak of the barn door swinging in the wind. Simple, honest, and mine. Things began to shift about 8 months after a new HOA took over the residential development that had slowly crept closer to our land like ivy. At first, I didn't pay much mind. They had their rules and fences. I had my fence lines and livestock. What business did they have with me? The first letter arrived, folded in a bright red envelope, like something you'd get from a debt collector. It was taped to the mailbox and bore a typed note from the Maple Hollow Estates Homeowners Association. The message was formal, but unmistakably hostile. Dear Mr. Dalton, it has come to our attention that the operations on your property, including the keeping of livestock, excessive noise, and visible farm structures, may be in violation of Maple Hollow residential environmental standards. We request immediate review and compliance within 14 days. Failure to respond may result in further action. I laughed. I shouldn't have. I thought it was a joke. I didn't live in their development. My property predated theirs by almost a century. My ranch had been surveyed, zoned, and operating legally since my great-grandfather broke the first fence post into this clay. I'd even had it reconfirmed when I inherited the property from my father after his heart gave out during winter branding season 7 years ago. So I ignored the letter. 2 weeks later, a man in a polo shirt with a laminate badge knocked on my door. He introduced himself as Rick from the HOA Compliance Committee. His badge had a little gold leaf border and an HOA logo I'd never seen before. Afternoon, Mr. Dalton. We just want to work with you, he said, gesturing toward my cattle pasture behind the house. The community's been expanding, and we have some shared concerns about livestock odors, runoff, and overall environmental impact. I stared at him. You're not from the county, no, sir. We're from the HOA. We're just looking for voluntary compliance before we elevate this to county enforcement. Cooperation keeps it neighborly, you know? I didn't answer. Instead, I closed the door slowly, deliberately. I'd dealt with men like him in Kandahar. They wore different uniforms, but had the same smirk. Not military, not law. But they spoke with authority because they thought most folks wouldn't know the difference. That night, I dug through my old paperwork, survey records, grandfathered agricultural permits, land easements, even a letter from the state certifying that my section of property had been zoned agricultural residential since 1932. Everything was in order. Still, over the next month, the letters kept coming. They started citing animal noise disturbances reported by nearby residents, a complaint about my barn lights being too bright at night, even one about excessive dust generated during feed delivery. I tried to laugh them off, but something had changed. I noticed a drone buzzing over my property one afternoon while I was mending a fence along the southern lot. It hovered for a good 2 minutes before zipping back toward the HOA neighborhood like a scout returning to its base. I reported it to the county sheriff's office, who shrugged and said unless it was invading my airspace or being weaponized, there wasn't much they could do. Then came the citation tacked to my front gate, this time, with a $500 violation fee attached for operating an unpermitted agricultural site within 300 feet of residential development. I called the number. A woman named Loretta from the HOA's legal committee answered and told me flatly that Maple Hollow HOA had broad regulatory authority under a revised zoning interpretation approved by a subcommittee in partnership with the county planning board. What zoning interpretation, I asked. This is ranch land. Bordering residential zones, she said coolly. Shared environmental concerns. I started to feel something I hadn't in years: anger. Not frustration, not confusion. That deep, slow-building kind of anger that starts in your ribs and grows teeth. It reminded me of what I used to feel in the weeks leading up to deployment when you knew something was going to go sideways, but you hadn't figured out how or when yet. I began taking notes. Every letter, every voicemail, every visit. I printed out emails, took photos of where HOA board members had stepped foot onto my land without permission, even recorded a conversation with a young man who claimed to be a noise auditor sent by the HOA. When I asked for his credentials, he muttered something about being a community volunteer and practically ran back to his Prius. Still, I hadn't pushed back yet. What finally made me stop waiting and start preparing was the moment they tried to call in animal control on my herd. They claimed I had unlicensed livestock wandering outside designated containment. It was laughable. My fences were solid and my cattle had tags and registration updated annually. But then, 2 animal control officers actually showed up. Friendly enough, but visibly annoyed that they'd been dispatched over what they later confirmed was a civil zoning disagreement, not an animal welfare issue. I saw it then. The HOA wasn't just throwing pebbles. They were laying landmines. They wanted to bankrupt me through fines, force me to shut down operations, or sell. Maybe to build more cookie-cutter homes with solar panels and faux shutters. Well, they were about to learn something. This wasn't just my ranch. It was my war room now. It started like a leak in the roof, barely noticeable, easy to dismiss. But by the second month, the HOA wasn't sending letters anymore. They were sending certified demands printed in bold, legalistic fonts with phrases like non-compliance property nuisance and imminent municipal escalation. They threw around threats like confetti at a parade, thinking I'd fold the minute they mentioned attorneys or county code. But they underestimated one thing. I don't intimidate easy. Not when I've had bullets fly past my head in foreign deserts. Not when I've watched friends take their last breath in dirt bunkers. Certainly not from a homeowner named Karen with a printed badge and a law degree from Google. Still, they were persistent. One morning, I walked out to feed the horses and found a large yellow placard zip-tied to my fence. It was laminated with the HOA seal stamped at the top, a little house with 3 pine trees behind it, and the words, "Notice of infraction," in block letters. According to their fine sheet, I owed $2,400 for excessive animal noise, Category B, improper odor. Management, Category C, unauthorized. Equipment, visible from road, Category A+. Visual degradation of neighborhood value. Category undefined. Visual degradation. What the hell did that even mean? That my barn wasn't painted beige, like their vinyl townhomes. I called the number on the notice and asked for whoever was responsible for issuing the fines. That's when I first heard her voice, Karen Talbot, HOA president. "Mr. Dalton," she said in that sing-song condescension people use when they think you're uneducated. "We've been more than patient, but we have to consider the greater good of the neighborhood." "The neighborhood," I said. "Lady, I don't even live in your neighborhood. My land doesn't fall under your association." Well, she countered, "We've consulted with our advisory committee, and there's legal precedence for action when non-member properties affect property values and quality of life." That's when I knew they were building a case, not a legal one, not really. They didn't have a leg to stand on in court. But they were building a pressure case, a harassment campaign dressed up in policy language, hoping I'd either fold under the financial weight or agree to some sort of HOA compliance package to keep the peace. I didn't sleep well that week. Every little sound set me on edge. The snap of a branch, the rattle of wind through the tin roofing, even the faint rumble of cars on the highway nearby. I knew those HOA bastards weren't done, and I started triple-checking my barn locks, switching the pad codes on the hay shed, and installing trail cams. Then came the landscaping truck. It pulled in just after 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was saddling up my mare when I heard the beeping sound of a backup alarm. I stepped out and saw 2 guys in matching khakis and gloves trimming the native brush that lined the back of my eastern fence, my fence. I jogged over. "Can I help you boys?" They paused. One of them held up a work order on a clipboard. "HOA asked us to clean up perimeter scrub for fire compliance," he said like it was just another Tuesday job. "That's my perimeter," I said. "That line over there," I pointed to the rusted survey marker, "is the property boundary. You're 6 feet into my land." The guy scratched his head and looked around. "You sure I damn well am. Now pack it up or I'll call the sheriff." They left, but not before one of them said, Sorry, sir, we were told it was part of the common zone. That was when I started to realize something deeper was going on. These weren't just citations or neighborly disputes. The HOA was actively trying to blur the lines, literally. By the end of the week, a small corner of my front pasture had been mulched and planted with wildflowers. A little wooden sign stood in the soil, "Welcome to Maple Hollow Pollinator Zone, protected by HOA Ordinance 7B. I almost laughed, but instead I took pictures. I documented everything from the GPS coordinates to the name of the landscaping company to the workers' truck plates. I sent it all to the county and requested a formal boundary inspection. I wasn't going to let them quietly nibble away at my land foot by foot with flower beds and faux conservation projects. But things escalated again. The following week, I received a notice from a law firm out of Denver, Briggs, Lowe, and Talbot. I recognized the last name immediately. Karen's husband was a lawyer. The letter claimed that my ranch was a non-conforming agricultural entity and that the HOA had a right to petition for injunction based on the noxious impacts of outdated rural operations adjacent to residential communities. I called a friend Tony, an old buddy from my deployment days, who had become a land use consultant in Colorado Springs. He came out 2 days later, chewed on a blade of grass, walked the property with me, and looked over the documents. "This is all garbage," he said, thumbing through the packet. "They're overstepping. Big time." "You have more standing than they do," I figured I said. "But how do I make them stop?" Tony grinned. "You don't ask them to stop. You make it hurt to keep going." And that's when I changed tactics. Instead of reacting to each new insult, like whack-a-mole, I went quiet. I let them think I was overwhelmed, maybe even broke. I stopped responding to letters. I played their game, dragging my boots in the mud while preparing something they wouldn't see coming, because I'd noticed something they clearly didn't want anyone looking too closely at. Down past the southern boundary, where the HOA's newer developments ended in neat rows of sidewalks and turf lawns, there were rows of soybeans planted along the slope crops that extended past the original development map. I hadn't paid much attention at first. After all, I wasn't the crop type. I raised livestock. But on one of my daily rides, I stopped near that line, looked closer, and followed it down toward the creek bed. That's when I saw it. Irrigation lines, fencing, even fertilizer bins, all set up on land that wasn't part of their official development. I pulled out my map, checked the county GIS overlay. My stomach flipped. That land. It wasn't theirs. It wasn't even private. It was public utility buffer land, leased by rotation, mostly for grazing. And 3 years ago, I'd applied for and been granted a lease on that same stretch. It had just never come up because I hadn't had the herd size to use it. Until now. The silence from the HOA was short-lived. I figured once they realized I hadn't been rattled by their lawyer's letter, they'd shift tactics again, and they did with a vengeance. Less than a week after I confirmed that their soybeans were growing on land I legally leased for grazing, I received a certified envelope from the county zoning office. Inside was a formal notice of review. Not revocation, not yet, but it might as well have been. The letter informed me that an anonymous complaint had triggered a formal land use compatibility investigation regarding my livestock operation. Apparently, the complaint alleged that my ranch was improperly zoned, that my cattle were in breach of containment, and that the operation posed runoff risk and pathogen concerns to adjacent residential properties. I sat at my kitchen table rereading that line while my dog Tank snored under my feet. Pathogens, what next? Accusing my cows of bioterrorism, I called the county office, and a tired-sounding woman named Beth answered. She explained that the complaint had come with photos and GPS coordinates, pictures of manure piles from composting cows near the back fence line, which they always grazed, and what someone claimed was contaminated water. Runoff, actually, a natural spring trickling downhill. I asked who submitted the complaint. She paused. It's anonymous, but the email domain is maplehollowhoa.org. Of course it was. Beth sounded apologetic. She admitted the whole thing was probably political and said she'd try to assign an inspector with some common sense. Still, protocol was protocol, and I'd be receiving a visit within 5 business days. So I started preparing. First, I called Tony again and asked if He could help me dig up every agricultural exemption historical usage record and permit renewal tied to my land. He drove in the next morning with a case of energy drinks, 3 USB drives full of documents, and the county zoning manual in hard copy. We set up shop on the porch surrounded by folders and maps and worked for 2 straight days. By the time we finished, we'd assembled a complete legal timeline showing that my family had been using that land for livestock for 78 years, long before HOA subdivisions existed. Not only was I fully within compliance under grandfathered agricultural zoning, but the county had renewed my livestock permit as recently as last winter. I had receipts, renewal letters, and even photos from the inspection. They don't have a case, Tony said, exhaling. But they're hoping you don't know that. That's when I told him about the soybeans. His eyebrows went up. Wait, you're saying they're encroaching? I nodded and showed him the map overlay with the GPS data I'd taken during my last ride. The county lease lines were clear as daylight. The HOA's crops were spilling 40 feet into public grazing land that, according to my lease, was under my stewardship. Tony leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. Now that's leverage. We decided to wait just a little longer. I wanted the inspection to go through. I wanted the county to see that not only was I in compliance, but that the HOA was projecting their own violations onto me. When the inspector came, he was a tall guy named Will, with a clipboard, sunglasses, and a battered straw hat. He looked like a rancher himself. I liked him instantly. "Let's get this over with," I said as he stepped out of the truck. He chuckled. "Don't worry. I already skimmed your permit file. This is just due process." We walked the land. I showed him the spring runoff and pointed out the compost setup. He even took photos of my electric fences, the shaded loafing areas, and the mineral blocks out near the back gate. We ended the inspection in the barn, where he made notes about tag compliance and animal condition. "Everything looks good," he said. "Honestly, Mr. Dalton, this place is cleaner than half the operations I've seen closer to town. I'll file my report within 48 hours. I asked him one last question before he left. What would happen if someone planted commercial crops on leased grazing land? He stopped in his tracks. "You mean without a lease or agricultural permit?" I nodded. "Well," he said, adjusting his sunglasses, "that'd be a violation of state trust land use. Could trigger penalties, removal orders, maybe even back rent if the land's already leased to someone else." I smiled. Good to know. 2 days later, I got the official report. My operation was in full compliance. No fines, no violations. And best of all, it was now documented in the county system. But I wasn't done yet. I wrote a formal letter to the county agricultural office, enclosing my photos, maps, lease documents, and 3 soil sample reports I paid out of pocket for proving that commercial farming was occurring on leased grazing land. I asked for an investigation, and I copied the county water board and land trust office. 3 days later, I received a phone call from a woman named Lacey at the Land Use Compliance Division. "Mr. Dalton," she said, "we've reviewed your evidence, and we're opening a case. You were absolutely right. Those crops shouldn't be there. It looks like someone's going to owe the county quite a bit." It felt like justice, but it wasn't quite revenge yet. Because while the HOA was in violation, they still thought they were winning. They didn't know that I was about to exercise my lease in full. Tony and I stood near the southern paddock gate that weekend, staring down at the green rows of soybeans swaying in the breeze. "You really gonna do it?" he asked. "I'm not just gonna do it," I said. "I'm gonna enjoy it." I pulled out my phone and called the livestock transport company. I told them to deliver the second herd, the one I'd been keeping at my cousin's place waiting for just the right moment. The next day, 38 head of cattle arrived in a convoy of trailers. We herded them through the southern gate and down toward the buffer zone, the land the HOA had been squatting on. The land I now had full rights to graze. It was time to let the cows eat. I stood at the southern fence line that morning, elbows resting on the top rail, watching the cattle move in deliberate lumbering rhythms through the soybean rows like they were returning to land they'd always known. Their tails flicked lazily, heads dipped low as they tore through the HOA's illegal crop with a kind of bovine serenity. It would have been funny if it hadn't meant so damn much. Because this wasn't just about grazing rights or a petty feud anymore. This was about legacy. The soil they walked on had once been tilled by my grandfather's hands. My dad had run cattle through these hills before I could even walk. And when he died alone in that barn after a snowstorm, we buried his ashes right here under the pine tree at the east corner of the property. I remember that day vividly. The sun was just breaking through gray skies, and the ground was frozen so solid we had to break it apart with crowbars. I hadn't cried during his funeral, not really. But I remembered kneeling in that hard soil palm flat against the earth and promising something quietly into the wind, I'll keep this place breathing no matter what. That promise had been like a weight on my shoulders for 7 years. Every fence I mended, every calf I pulled during a midnight birth, every lone day out of riding the edge of the back 40, I was doing it not just for survival, but because I believed this land deserved to stay in the family. Not parceled off, not paved over, and certainly not choked out by plastic fences and vinyl siding. And yet now some HOA president with a grudge and a lawyer for a husband had tried to shut it all down piece by piece, through bureaucracy and bad faith. I clenched the rail-tighter jaw locked as I watched Karen Talbot's white Lexus pull up to the edge of the gravel trail. She got out in heels and a bright lemon-yellow blouse, holding her phone like it was a badge. She didn't step onto the land, not yet, just stood there watching my cattle graze through what used to be her community's soy project. Her voice rang out across the field, high-pitched and piercing. "Mr. Dalton, you can't just turn this into a petting zoo. You're trespassing." I took my time walking up to the fence, dusting my gloves against my jeans. "Nope," I said. "I'm grazing cattle on leased county buffer land. You know, the same land you've been farming on without permission. You're ruining everything," she snapped. "Do you have any idea how much those crops cost, our HOA?" I looked her dead in the eye. "Do you have any idea how much this land means to me?" She blinked, thrown by the calm in my voice. I took a step forward. "You've been fining me, threatening me, accusing me of violations I never committed. You tried to weaponize the zoning board. You trespassed onto my land with landscaping crews. And then you planted crops on land that wasn't even yours. It was a community improvement project," she hissed. "No," I said. "It was theft, dressed up in HOA stationery." She opened her mouth again, probably to make another threat, but then one of my calves bolted out of the thicket and crashed into the center of a soybean row, kicking up dirt. Karen jumped back and shrieked, dropping her phone into the grass. I didn't laugh. I could have, but I didn't. Because despite everything, I didn't hate her. Not really. What I did hate was what she represented: the slow crawl of arrogance, entitlement, and blind suburban control that didn't understand land, except in terms of what it could be turned into. So, Deck's community center's parking lots, they didn't get it. Land lived. It breathed, suffered, healed. It carried the fingerprints of every hand that had worked it. Later that day, I sat in the old rocking chair on the porch, the same one my dad had used when he smoked cigars after branding season. Tank laid across my boot's tail, thumping lightly. I held the worn leather notebook Dad had passed down his old ranch journal and flipped through pages, full of hand-sketched pasture maps, breeding schedules, rainfall tallies, even thoughts about how to keep the herd calm during thunder. At the very back was a note in his thick, jagged handwriting: "Don't let anyone tell you this land isn't worth the fight. It's ours because we never stopped respecting it." That's what the HOA didn't understand. You can't threaten a man out of something he's sworn to protect. 2 days later, I got a letter from the county land office confirming that an official cease and desist order had been issued against the Maple Hollow HOA. They were found to be in violation of land lease boundaries, misappropriating public use acreage, and engaging in unauthorized agricultural activity. They were being fined retroactively for the past 3 seasons. The soy crop had to be removed. I pinned that letter to the barn wall with a thumbtack and left it there like a war trophy. The following weekend, my neighbors down the road, Ben and Risa Jenkins, showed up with a jug of lemonade and a tray of ribs. "Heard you let the cows have a buffet," Ben said with a grin. "We're thinking of calling it the Great Soybean Stampede." I laughed for the first time in weeks. As the evening settled in and cicadas started their slow song, we sat around a small fire pit, watching the stars blink through the treetops. Risa asked me if I ever thought about selling. Not once, I said. But wasn't it hard? She asked. All the legal mess, the threats, the noise, I nodded. It was hell. But sometimes hell's the only road back to peace. They stayed until midnight. When they left, I walked the pasture one last time, boots damp from dew. The cattle were calm, full-bellied, some lying in the same field the HOA once called theirs. I reached the pine tree at the edge and knelt beside it. Dad, I whispered, voice low. They tried, but I didn't let them win. A breeze moved through the branches. Maybe it was nothing, but it felt like an answer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on, that this wasn't just a petty squabble over fences or sound complaints. Ever since the HOA started their campaign against my ranch, I'd seen glimpses of something sloppy beneath their arrogance, missteps, paper trails they didn't expect anyone to follow. And the soy field was the first thread I pulled. It started with a question I couldn't get out of my head. How far were they really willing to go to claim land they didn't own? I saddled up my gelding, Brick, just after sunrise the next day, and rode out along the southern trail beyond the grazing land, now flush with hoof prints and chewed stems. I wanted a clearer picture of the HOA's crop lines, not from a map or a drone flyover, but from the land itself. You learn a lot from the soil, from the way the fence posts lean, from which direction the irrigation lines bend. Land tells you the truth if you've got enough patience to listen. About a mile out where the wild mustard gave way to tilled rows, I dismounted and tied Brick to a cedar snag. The rows of soybeans were uniform, tightly packed, too tight. The irrigation system, a drip line set up with PVC elbows, ran in a grid that extended far beyond the last HOA home. I paced it, every row, every corner. By my count, it pushed 40 yards south, beyond their legal development boundary, and right into the land I had a county lease on. I pulled out my phone and opened the GIS overlay app Tony had helped me install. I waited for the signal to lock, then walked a full perimeter around the field, tagging my coordinates at each post, at each turn in the rows. When I finished and connected the dots, the outline didn't match the HOA parcel map. It matched mine. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the glowing map on the screen. Then I looked up at the field around me. Green dense, thriving. Rows upon rows of soybeans glistening with dew, all growing on my leased land. The county had granted me rotational grazing rights here 3 years back when they opened applications for agricultural use of utility buffer zones. I hadn't used it until now. The HOA had been farming here illegally, quietly, possibly for years. I took pictures, wide shots, close-ups of irrigation heads, even the little wooden sign posted at the north end of the field that read, Maple Hollow Agricultural Sustainability Pilot. There was an HOA logo on it, faded but still visible. That sign alone was damning. I sent everything to Tony. 20 minutes later he called. Dalton, I swear to God, if you told me this yesterday, I'd have said you were imagining things, he said, but this is gold. That's fraud. If they're harvesting or selling any of that crop, and it's on leased public land they don't own, they're in violation of state land use law. Think the county will care, I asked. Oh, they'll care, and the HOA will care more when they get the bill. He paused for a second. But let me ask you something. Shoot. You planning on just reporting it? I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I hadn't decided. A part of me wanted to take the high road. File the complaint, let the county handle it, watch the HOA sweat under the weight of real law. But another part of me, the one that remembered every letter taped to my gate, every fine that tried to drown me in debt, every insult about my unsightly livestock, wanted something more immediate. A message. They had tried to shut me down using rules they barely understood. Now I had rules they couldn't ignore. That night I pulled out the county lease agreement and read it again. Section 4.3 made it crystal clear. The leaseholder may exercise livestock grazing rights over the designated area for the duration of the agreement, provided it does not conflict with existing structures or neighboring lawful usage. Any unlawful development or unpermitted agricultural activity on said land may be subject to immediate removal or livestock ingress by the leaseholder. I laughed. Out loud. It echoed through the kitchen. Livestock ingress. That was the county's way of saying you break the rules, you lose your right to keep cattle off this land. I had the green light. Before sunrise the next morning, I walked the perimeter again, this time stringing a temporary single-line fence with flagged wire just enough to guide the herd once I brought them through. I placed mineral tubs along the slope and filled a trough from the spring. I wanted everything to be by the book. No cruelty, no chaos. Just cows grazing where they were legally entitled to graze. By mid-morning, I'd walked the lead steer to the gate and watched as he sniffed the air, eyed the soybean rows, and took a cautious step forward, then another, then another. Within 5 minutes, the whole herd followed it. They didn't stampede, they wandered, like kids discovering a buffet. I stood with my arms crossed, watching them settle into the rhythm of munching and meandering their bodies, moving in waves through the illegal field, like nature correcting a mistake. Tank barked from the truck bed. Even he could feel at that moment when justice doesn't come in gavels or lawsuits, but in hooves and dust and quiet restoration. I wasn't blind. I knew this would cause a scene, but that was the point. Because while Karen and her crew had tried to make me invisible, like my work, my life, my family's land, didn't matter, I'd decided I would not go quietly. The land was speaking now, and it was speaking in lowing sounds and snapped soybean stems. After the cattle had their first taste of HOA-grown soybeans, I expected the fallout to come quick and hot. I braced for it. But strangely, for the next 2 days, there was silence. No visits, no drones, no laminated threats slapped on my fence. The calm unnerved me. It was the kind of quiet you get right before a summer storm tears the roof off your barn. I needed to stay ahead of them. Not just legally, I had already secured that edge. I needed to get in front of the narrative. HOA boards like Karen's didn't rely on facts or land maps, they thrived on optics, on curated outrage, on weaponized community values. If I was going to win this, it couldn't just be legal. It had to be public. So I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Her name was Leslie Ruiz, a retired property attorney who'd once represented small landowners against county overreach and HOA overstep. She'd done some consulting for veterans' homestead disputes a decade ago, back when I helped organize legal aid clinics for retired service members. She was tough, sharp, and about as fond of HOAs as a rattlesnake was of a lawnmower. She picked up on the second ring. Dalton. Didn't think I'd hear from you again unless someone tried to sell your barn on Craigslist. Close, I said. They're trying to litigate me out of my own land. I gave her the whole story, Karen, the fake citations, the noise complaints, the illegal soybeans. When I finished, there was a pause on the other end. Well, she said finally, this might be the most HOA thing I've ever heard. And I've defended a guy who got fined for having a rooster-shaped mailbox. So I asked, do I have a case? She scoffed. You've got 3. Let's start with civil trespass. Then there's abusive process using complaint systems to harass you. And finally, encroachment onto county lease land with the intent to profit. That last one's juicy. If we can prove they harvested a single bushel, we're talking state-level penalties. But I don't want to sue, I said. That caught her off guard. You don't? No, I said. I want them to know I could. And then I want them to back the hell off. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, okay, then here's what we'll do. You're going to make moves, but you're going to make them quietly. No sabers rattling, no Facebook tirades. You're going to document everything, hand it to the right people, and let the weight of the law sit heavy on their doorstep until they feel it in their bones. We started with formal declarations. She helped me draft a cease and desist letter directed to the Maple Hollow HOA board, citing encroachment and misappropriation of county-leased land. It wasn't threatening, it was factual, cold, and lined with references to case laws. We sent it by certified mail and digitally to every board member, including Karen Talbot. Next, we filed a public records request with the County Agricultural Office asking for any permits, applications, or correspondences submitted by the HOA related to crop use on buffer land. If they had tried to sneak something through, we'd find it. If they hadn't, which was more likely, it would show they'd acted without a shred of authorization. Finally, Leslie contacted the local newspaper editor, someone she'd gone to law school with, and handed over a packet maps photos, lease agreements, and the letter from the county confirming my grazing rights. She didn't spin it. She didn't use my name. She just labeled the file HOA crops grown on public land citizen holds grazing rights. We didn't ask for a story. But the paper ran one anyway. The headline hit the town like a lightning bolt. HOA soybeans grow on borrowed land. Local rancher legally grazes cattle on disputed acres. They didn't name me directly, but the picture told the story clear enough. My herd grazing calmly among the broken rows, the HOA sign half trampled in the background. The article quoted the county compliance office, which confirmed that an active investigation was underway, and that the land in question had indeed been leased for grazing, not cultivation. Karen must have seen it by breakfast, because by noon, her SUV came crawling down the trail again. I was in the middle of replacing a cracked water line when she stepped out, flanked this time by two HOA board members I recognized from their monthly newsletters, Don Whitford, the treasurer, and Elise McPherson, head of landscape and community aesthetics. All three looked like they were walking into a courtroom. Karen opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. Before you say a word, I said yes, they're allowed to graze. Yes, the county has confirmed it. And yes, you were growing crops on land that didn't belong to you. Don blurted out, that was an honest mistake. I raised an eyebrow. You had a printed sign claiming the project. Mistakes don't come with branding. Karen stepped forward. What do you want from us? I tilted my head. Funny. That's the question I should have been asking you 4 months ago. They didn't speak. I took a breath and looked each of them in the eye. Here's what I want, stop the citations. Cancel every bogus fine. Take your drone off my airspace. Stay off my fence line. And retract every complaint you filed with the county. All of them. And if we don't, Elise asked. I stepped closer just enough for my voice to stay low. Then I file for damages. I call the DA. And I let every local news station see exactly how HOA dues are being spent on crops grown illegally, and lawyers hired to silence a veteran rancher on his own land. For a second, Karen looked like she might argue. But then she noticed the envelope under my arm, county seal, on the front, thick with form signatures and formal declarations of boundary violations. The weight of it was real. She exhaled. We'll take it to the board. You do that, I said, and I'll keep the cows right where they are until then. They turned without another word. As they drove off, dust trailing behind their tires, I couldn't help but feel a strange kind of peace, not the quiet before a storm this time, but the calm that comes after standing your ground. And yet deep down I knew they wouldn't give up that easily. Karen Talbot wasn't the type to walk away without trying something. I just hoped she understood what the cattle already knew. This land wasn't hers to control. Not now. Not ever. The morning started with a low fog, the kind that makes everything look like a faded photograph. The air was damp but quiet, save for the occasional grunt or hoof shuffle from the corral. The cows were restless. Maybe they sensed something. Maybe they just wanted out of their pen. But I knew this wasn't going to be a regular grazing day, because this was the day I'd let them walk in. Not sneak, not trespass, walk. Like they belonged because they did. Legally, ethically, and with the full weight of the county on my side. I had a stack of documents in the passenger seat of my truck, just in case anyone got curious. My county leased the cease and desist order against the HOA soil samples, proving their cultivation, the grazing clause, highlighted in yellow. All of it notarized and neatly tabbed. Leslie had drilled it into me, be prepared, not just write. They'll push you on optics if they can't push you on law. So I was ready. I opened the south gate slowly. My lead cow, a stubborn Hereford I named Daisy, was the first to step forward. She hesitated at the threshold for just a second, sniffing the dirt, flicking her tail, then ambled forward like she was going home. The others followed. No herding needed. No yells or claps or whistles, just the rhythmic sound of hooves moving into forbidden fields now reclaimed. The soy plants swayed and crunched under their weight, stalks, bending, snapping, vanishing into cud. It was beautiful. Not because it was revenge, though. I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel like it, but because it felt like balance. They had taken what didn't belong to them, and now the land was taking something back. I stood at the fence and watched as the herd spread out across the slope. No panic, no chaos, just slow chewing and satisfied grunts. I checked the mineral tubs I'd laid out earlier and adjusted the solar-powered fence line on the western edge. Tank trotted beside me, nose twitching, tail upright. He barked once toward the ridge, and I looked up, and of course, there she was, Karen Talbot, standing on the HOA trailhead in her cream-colored jacket and knee-high boots, holding a phone aimed square at my cattle. From this distance, I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I didn't need to. She was filming, gathering evidence. She waved her hand in big, sweeping motions, then turned to speak with someone off frame. Probably another board member. Maybe even one of those faux environmental consultants she liked to bring in during meetings to sound more official. I pulled my phone out and started filming too. Let the record show my cattle were grazing on legally leased public land. Not once did they cross into the HOA's residential zone. Not once did they damage private property. They were walking on my lease, reclaiming soil the HOA had no right to in the first place. 10 minutes later, I heard tires crunching gravel. A county deputy's cruiser pulled up near the main gate. My gut didn't twist this time, not like it had when I was first getting ambushed with fake complaints. Now I had every piece of paper I needed to prove that they were the ones out of line. The deputy stepped out. His badge said Stanton, and his face looked familiar. Probably someone I'd seen at the county fair or the feed store. Morning, he said, nodding toward the cows. Got a report of cattle loose on HOA green space. I smiled and handed him the folder. Actually, they're grazing on county buffer land. Here's my lease agreement. The HOA had planted crops here illegally. That's been confirmed. I'm within my rights. He flipped through the documents, taking his time. I could see his jaw tighten as he read. Looks pretty clear to me, he said. You even got the soil tests in here. Yep, I said. Everything's labeled. Want a cup of coffee while you review? He chuckled. I'll take a rain check, but thanks. He radioed something in, then walked the boundary with me. I pointed out the flagged fence lines, the original survey markers, the temporary signage I'd posted at the Gate County lease grazing in progress. Authorized access only. Every piece was in place. Karen stormed down the trail to meet us halfway. She was breathing hard, phone still in hand. Officer, this is absurd, she said. He let those animals trample our conservation project. Stanton nodded slowly. Ma'am, according to the documents here, this field was not a registered conservation site. It was illegally cultivated on county land leased for grazing. That lease is active and binding. But those cows are destroying our investment, dozens of hours of work. They're eating soybeans, he said. Soybeans planted in violation of county lease laws. If anything, Mr. Dalton's use is correcting the situation. She sputtered, mouth opening and closing. You have no idea the pressure we're under to keep this neighborhood attractive. I'm not here for neighborhood politics, Stanton said. I'm here for the law. And right now, Mr. Dalton's well within it. She turned her glare on me, her face red. This isn't over. No, I said, but it's no longer yours to control. Stanton gave her a polite nod, then left after logging the visit. Karen lingered for a moment longer, then turned on her heel and marched back up the hill, rage practically steaming off her shoulders. I turned back to the herd still grazing peacefully in rows that had once belonged, at least in Karen's imagination, to her kingdom of order and lawn care regulations. Daisy let out a loud belch and stomped on another patch of soy. I patted her side. Good girl. That night, I got a call from Leslie. Well, she asked. They came, they saw. They didn't find me. She laughed, warm and proud. They're folding. They just haven't realized it yet. I don't want to gloat, I said. I just want them to leave me the hell alone. And they will, she said. Or they'll keep making it worse for themselves. You keep walking the line clean, Dalton. Let the truth do the talking. I stepped out onto the porch and looked out over the pasture. The moonlight made the grass silver, the cows just shadows on the slope. It was quiet again this time, the kind of quiet I liked. Earned. Honest. Because on that day, my cattle didn't just walk into a field. They walked into a fight I didn't start, but damn sure knew how to finish. The next day, the air felt different. Not just because of the lingering tension, but because the HOA wasn't done, Karen Talbot especially. If there was one thing I'd learned from the past few months, it was this HOA Karen didn't know how to lose quietly. So it didn't surprise me when I saw her again this time in full battle regalia blazer, clipboard, oversized sunglasses, and a Bluetooth headset, she wore like a command center. She wasn't alone, either. 3 men in polo shirts stood with her near the HOA trailhead. I recognized one as their landscaping supervisor, the others I didn't know. But they had that unmistakable HOA posture, upright hands, clasped, scanning the property like generals inspecting a battlefield. I was mucking out the barn when Tank barked once his "they're back" bark. I walked toward the south slope, and by the time I arrived at the fence, Karen was already pacing with her phone raised, filming again. "Mr. Dalton," she called out, "you are now being documented for unlawful property destruction, and your animals are trespassing." I didn't bother responding. One of the men beside her, balding nervous, whispered something and Karen stiffened. Then she held her phone higher and said loudly, "We're calling the sheriff. Right now." She pressed a button with great flair and put the call on speaker. I heard the dispatcher answer. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespass in progress," Karen said, voice falsely calm. "A landowner has released dozens of cattle into a protected community green zone. There's active destruction of property and a threat to environmental safety." I leaned my arms over the top rail and waited. "Can you confirm the address?" the dispatcher asked. Karen rattled off the HOA's central office address, not realizing or not caring that it had nothing to do with where the cows were grazing. Then she added, "This man has defied multiple HOA violations and is openly harassing board members." I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a separate number, Deputy Stanton's direct line. He'd given it to me after his last visit. He answered after one ring. "Dalton." "You might be getting another call about my cows," I said. "Karen's back." He sighed. "Already got it. I'm on my way. Sit tight." I hung up and crossed my arms again, meeting Karen's eyes from across the field. "This is harassment," she shouted. "You've humiliated our community. These animals are ruining soil we've spent thousands restoring." I pointed toward the now visible marker stakes still standing along the boundary. "Those stakes were there before you even moved in." Karen's face twitched. "You don't care about the community. You just want to humiliate us." I didn't say it, but the irony stung because from the beginning, they had tried to erase me, not the other way around. 20 minutes later, Stanton's cruiser pulled into the gravel access road. He stepped out slowly, thumb hooked into his belt, nodding at both of us like a parent arriving to break up a playground fight. Karen stormed toward him. "I've called 3 times," she said. "This has to stop. These animals are unsanitary, dangerous," and Stanton held up a hand. "Ms. Talbot, I've reviewed the lease agreement, the cease and desist orders, and the soil compliance reports. Mr. Dalton is well within his rights to graze on that land." Karen blinked. "But it's public." "That's right," Stanton said, calm. "And it's leased to him by the county for agricultural use. You cannot restrict access, interfere, or harass him while he exercises those rights." She tried to pivot. "But we planted," I know he said, "illegally, which is why the county issued a violation against the HOA and not Mr. Dalton." She looked like she'd been slapped. Then she turned back toward me, her voice sharp. "You've embarrassed our board in front of the whole town." "No," I said. "You did that. I just grazed some cattle." For a long second, none of us moved. Then in one final grasp at control, she pulled out a printed paper from her clipboard, some kind of pseudo-legal notice she'd probably drafted in a fit of fury. "This is a formal declaration," she began, "that your livestock operations are no longer welcome adjacent to Maple Hollow Estates, and if you do not comply with community standards." Stanton stepped between us, took the paper from her hand, glanced at it, and handed it back. "Ma'am, this has no legal bearing. You can't create ordinances that override county law." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. Stanton turned to me. "You good here? Just fine," I said. As Karen and her entourage turned and marched back toward the paved trail, I couldn't help but notice something different in her stride. It wasn't anger. It was uncertainty. She was starting to realize this wasn't a war she could win with clipboards and committees. Her weapons, fines, threats, complaints had failed, and for the first time she was retreating without a plan. I watched her disappear behind the manicured hedge at the HOA entrance and let out a slow breath. The cattle, oblivious to everything, continued to chew. Tank wagged his tail beside me and barked once satisfied. That evening, I called Leslie and told her what had happened. She laughed. Karen tried to escalate again, huh? These people always forget law is heavier than outrage. I leaned back in my chair, watching the sun dip behind the ridge. The herd's silhouettes stretched long across the grass, peaceful as ever. No one's tried to stop me in 2 hours, I said. That's a record, Leslie replied. I smiled. Maybe tomorrow they'll try something new. Let them, she said. You're not alone anymore, and you're not just fighting for yourself. You're setting a line in the sand for every farmer or rancher who's been bulldozed by a board with no clue what the land means. I didn't say anything for a long time. I just listened to the wind across the pasture, the creak of the barn's weathered boards, the low call of a calf to its mother, and I realized something. For the first time in months, I wasn't bracing for the next attack. I was watching them fall apart instead. If Karen Talbot thought calling the sheriff would somehow rally the neighborhood to her side, she underestimated just how much the community had changed. It wasn't the 1990s anymore. People didn't blindly trust a clipboard and a badge-shaped HOA pin. And folks in Maple Hollow, for all their carefully trimmed hedges and mailbox color charts, had grown tired of being ruled by fear masquerading as order. The local newspaper had run a follow-up piece after the deputy's visit. This time they did use my name. Veteran rancher holds his ground cattle graze legally as HOA violation surface. Under the headline was a full-width photograph of me in my denim shirt and wide-brimmed hat, leaning on the fence line cattle calmly behind me. My lease document was tucked under one arm. It looked staged, but it wasn't. The photographer had shown up unannounced the day before, said he just wanted a quote. I gave him one sentence. I'm just taking care of the land like my father did with respect. The article laid it all out, how the HOA had cultivated soybeans on county-leased grazing land, how they'd issued dozens of illegitimate citations to a legal ranching operation, how they'd tried to weaponize zoning complaints and nuisance ordinances against a veteran who'd lived on his land since birth. The comments section exploded. This HOA is out of control. That man's a hero. My uncle had the same problem down south. I hope he charges admission to see the cows next. They picked the wrong cowboy. What followed wasn't just a shift in tone. It was a turning of the tide. I started getting phone calls, first from neighbors I barely knew. Dalton, I'm Steve over on Willow Bend. I read the article. Just wanted to say, we're with you. You ever need a witness for anything, you got me. Then came local business owners. Sir, we'd be honored to sponsor feed deliveries for your herd this season. Free of charge. We're putting a banner on our window. We back the ranch. And then unbelievably from inside the HOA itself. The first message was from Elise McPherson, the board member who had stood behind Karen during her crusade. Mr. Dalton, she said on voicemail, her voice tight. I'd like to extend a formal apology for any stress we've caused. I believe the board may have overstepped. If there's any way we can de-escalate the situation. The second message came from Don Whitford, their treasurer. He was more direct. We're going to have a vote. Karen's facing pressure to resign. I think you'll like the outcome. Sure enough, by the end of that week, an email leaked from inside the HOA board. It showed minutes from an emergency session. Motion to request the resignation of Karen Talbot as board president due to conduct detrimental to the HOA's legal standing and community trust. Result passed. 4 yes, 1 no. Karen's name wasn't listed as voting. She was present, but silent. That's when the real cracks started showing. A few days later, a stack of lawn signs appeared around the development, Stop the Power Games vote for accountability and end abuse of HOA authority. It was surreal. People who once avoided eye contact at the feed store now waved at me in traffic. Parents brought their kids to the edge of the trail to watch the cattle graze. One boy asked if he could name one. I pointed to the oldest steer and said, that one's yours. He looks like a Walter, doesn't he? The boy beamed. Walter. It is. Even the town's mayor, a gruff man named Bill Parsons, who'd rarely been seen outside City Hall, showed up one evening in boots and jeans. I read everything he said. Hell of a mess they tried to put you through. We've had issues with Maple Hollow before, but nothing like this. He paused. You ever think about serving on the land use board? I blinked. Me, yeah, he said. Someone like you, someone who knows what dirt feels like under his nails. We could use that. I didn't answer right away. The idea of sitting in a meeting room while people argued over drainage plans and setbacks made my stomach churn. But the offer meant something. It meant they saw me, not just as a stubborn old rancher, but as someone who stood his ground with dignity. That weekend, I held a small gathering at the ranch, just some neighbors, a few folks from the county offices, and the Jenkins couple who'd brought ribs weeks earlier. We set up a grill by the barn, stacked hay bales as benches, and watched the cows shuffle under the low orange sky. Someone brought a guitar, someone else brought a pecan pie. No one talked about HOA policy. We talked about land, about legacy, about how good it felt to not be afraid anymore. Late in the evening, as the stars came out and the wind carried the smell of earth and firewood, I stood up and raised a glass of sweet tea. To those who tried to fence us in, I said, and to the cattle who tore those fences down one hoof at a time. Laughter, cheers, a few hoots, and then silence, again the kind you earn. Not fear, because when a bully loses power, what's left behind isn't just relief. It's dignity restored. The next morning, the light came in soft over the ridge, bathing the pasture in amber and brushing the barn's eastern face with gold. The cows moved in slow arcs, quiet, full-bellied content. Tank trotted ahead of me, occasionally stopping to sniff the wind or roll in something unspeakable. I walked with a cup of black coffee in my hand, not because there was any fire to put out, but because I could. For the first time in months, I wasn't waking up to prepare for battle. No code violations taped to the fence. No anonymous complaints about mooing. No nervous glances at the mailbox, wondering if another fake lawsuit was waiting inside. Just the quiet hum of land breathing under its own rhythm. Karen had officially resigned. Her name disappeared from the HOA's newsletter like someone had snipped it out with scissors. The new interim president, a retired teacher named Mark Hollis, sent me a letter, an actual handwritten letter, expressing regret for the board's past behavior and promising that no further action would be taken against my ranch so long as your operations remain lawful and within county guidelines. I laughed when I read that last part. They'd spent months trying to redefine the law to suit their narrative, and now they were finally acknowledging what I knew from the start, that the law had always been on my side. I didn't reply to Mark's letter. Not because I didn't appreciate it, but because it didn't need a response. Some things are better answered with silence and a strong fence. The soy fields had long since been cleared. County workers came in with tractors and churned up the last of the HOA's illegal rows, leaving behind scarred soil and faded stakes. I offered to let the land rest for a season, but the county asked me to continue grazing, said it helped with erosion control and regrowth. So I kept the cattle there. Not as a provocation, but as a stewardship. The cows did what cows do, ate fertilized, wandered. Nature healed what human arrogance had tried to exploit. And me, I healed too. I fixed the eastern water line that had cracked under last winter's freeze. I repainted the barn doors not because anyone asked me to, but because it felt good to take care of something again. I mended the fence line near the ridge where the posts had leaned too long. I even finally rebuilt the little bench beneath the pine tree where my father's ashes were scattered. The old one had rotted years ago, but I'd never gotten around to replacing it. This time I did it with cedar and steel bolts solid, the way he would have liked it. One evening I sat there with a cold beer in hand, watching the sun lower itself into the western hills. The breeze picked up carrying the smell of sweet hay and warm earth. I felt something settle in my chest. Not victory, not triumph. Peace. That's what had been missing. Not quiet, there had been plenty of that in the worst months, but peace. The kind that only comes when you've stood your ground and nothing more needs to be said. A few weeks later, the county sent me a plaque. It was small, simple, with my name engraved on it and the words, "In recognition of community integrity, land stewardship, and lawful resistance." I didn't know what to do with it at first. It felt ceremonial, like something they give you when you're done fighting. But I wasn't done. Not really. This land still needed me. The cows still needed me. And now, oddly enough, the community needed me too. The mayor followed through on his offer. I got appointed to the Land Use Advisory Board by unanimous vote. At first I resisted. I hated meetings, hated the idea of spending my days in conference rooms. But then I remembered all the people who didn't have the words, the paperwork, the stubbornness to fight back like I did. And I thought maybe if I sat in those rooms, I could be the guy who looked out for them. The quiet one in the back who asked the question that stopped a bulldozer. I showed up to the first meeting in jeans and boots. Everyone else wore khakis. I didn't care. When they asked me to introduce myself, I said, "My name's Dalton Reed. I'm a rancher. And I believe land remembers who respects it." Nobody clapped. They didn't need to. These days, I still ride the Boundary Trail every morning. Still tip my hat to the hills. Still stop by the pine tree before the day gets busy. And sometimes when the wind picks up just right, I swear I hear my father's voice in it, not words, just approval. The sound a man makes when he knows something worth protecting is still in the right hands. Karen Talbot moved away. Her house went on the market quietly. Rumor was she accepted a job in another HOA 2 counties over. I never saw her pack. She didn't say goodbye. But that's all right. Some exits don't need closure. As for the HOA, they're quieter now, more cautious. The board meets once a month and nobody talks about expanding buffer zones or fighting the ranch next door. Their newsletter is filled with bake sales and gardening tips, just the way it should have been all along. Tank's getting older. He doesn't bark at the trailhead as much anymore. Just lies in the shade by the barn and watches the world pass like it's all part of some grand story he already knows the ending to. Maybe it is. Because in the end, this wasn't a story about soybeans or cattle or fences. It was about knowing who you are when someone tries to erase you. It was about standing in the dirt and saying, "This land remembers me." You don't get to rewrite that. And that more than any court ruling or headline or HOA meeting is how I won. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with roots.